Welcome back to the channel, folks, and today we're going to expand horizons as we head over to the Region of Three Oaks Museum, and we're going to take a look at the Warren calculating engine. And that calculating machine was the predecessor of little gizmos like this, little adding machine, and eventually led to, yeah, you guessed it, today's technology. Now, Fredrick Warren developed 3 calculating engines. 1 and 2 are in the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., and this is what they had to say about those 2. One of the first, if not the first, calculating machine built in the United States. And the one that you're going to see today is the 3rd and most advanced calculating machine that he developed. We have 2 presenters today who are going to give us a little history background on Fredrick, the inventor, and the science behind it. So let's look at Fredrick's calculating machine before it heads back to Michigan State University.
But I have to say that his invention brought jobs and purpose and population and an economic engine to the town. But I have to say that a decade earlier, his brother Fred invented something no less amazing, perhaps more amazing than Featherbone, though due to tragic circumstances, Fred's calculating engine made far less of an impact on the world. I encourage you to think about what Three Oaks would be like if the calculating engine had been brought to commercial fruition. E.K. Warren never would have thought of Featherbone because he'd be busy helping Fred turn these out. And Three Oaks, rather than relying on a product that dissolved when featherbone corsets, or whalebone corsets went out of style and buggy whips, would have had something that really could have survived. It could have become the Armonk, New York, the headquarters of IBM or something. So it's an interesting what if. Anyway, Fredrick Parsons Warren was born in 1839 in Connecticut, though he soon moved to Ludlow, Vermont, where his brothers Edward, E.K., the inventor of Featherbone, and Albert were born. Now, Fred was a precocious guy. As a young teen, he devised a windmill and put it on top of his parents' cabin in Ludlow. That's Fred up on the roof. Fred up on the roof pointing out his device. I don't have any information about what that windmill actually powered within the dwelling, but I do know that he didn't build one on the home that they moved to in Three Oaks, south of town, in the 1850s. As a teen, he got into photography, which is why we have photos of these dwellings. He created early photos, mostly ambrotypes, and I'm not smart enough about photography to tell you how that technology works, but they're glass negatives, and there are a lot of them at Michigan State, which are interesting to go through, and you have to handle them very carefully because the stuff comes off the glass plates while you're copying it, and you feel like you're destroying history along with preserving it. So that's a picture of his little brother Ed, E.K. Warren, the inventor of Featherbone. He was about 10 or 12 there, and it was taken when Fred was the teacher at the Spring Creek School just south of Three Oaks. He was about 18 or 20. He was in the Union Army during the Civil War. He wrote interesting letters home. He didn't see any combat. He was in Arkansas just as the war was kind of winding down, mostly writing about how awful life in an army camp was. But his letters are actually pretty entertaining and witty. There are some excerpts of them in the exhibit. He learned how to repair watches, so when he returned home, he built a shop for himself. That's him in the 2nd story window. And this right here is where Viola Restaurant was, or is. And so this is the site of what was then Lindner Chevrolet, and 104 North Elm, I think was the address. Then he also was the editor of Three Oaks' first newspaper, and he wrote with real wit about the village. There's some excerpts of some of his articles over there. And then shortly before he went off to war, he had been reading about the work of the English mathematician and inventor Charles Babbage. Fred Warren got interested in building a calculating machine. Babbage had built one that didn't really work in England about 50 years before. And Fred decided he could try and perfect it. And by the early 1870s, his interest had become kind of an all-consuming project. He put together his first calculating machine in 1872, but he knew he could improve it and immediately threw himself into that task. His second device could do arithmetic problems, though he wrote to his brother Albert, "I cannot call this machine a decided success because it has to work slow, and in some places where there are several carries together, the machine will stop." He wrote he'd even given up his day job to pursue what sounded like an obsession at this point. "I found my health would not admit to the strain of old watches and machine at the same time. Company annoys me. I cannot bear to have anybody around." And he could give up watch repair because his brother Edward, a successful merchant at this point, but not yet the inventor of Featherbone, had formed a partnership with him. Their stationery proclaimed the office of the Warren brothers, proprietors of the calculating engine. The Warrens really weren't thinking about becoming IBM or Apple and creating an office machine. They were really more intent on becoming a showbiz smash, to invent something that would amaze the citizens and take it around and charge people to see it. "I think a machine can be made that will astonish the world," Fred wrote to his brother Albert, who was out in California hoping to strike gold of another sort. "It will truly be a wonderful machine, as it does all that Babbage's calculating engine was intended to do, and much more besides." He warned Albert to keep all of this to himself, not to let the word out. Working in a room behind the watch shop, Fred finished his second calculating engine in the early 1874. Both the first and the second calculating engines are in the collection of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, which says that it's very likely the first working calculating machine invented in the U.S., created in the U.S. So then in August of '74, he begins work on what I call Calculating Engine 3.0. It consumed him, and he wrote Albert, "I ought to get married and settle down, but this thing has got into my head, and I will have to put it off for 2 or 3 years." However, Fred Warren never married because he didn't have 2 or 3 years left. He was suffering increasingly from tuberculosis, and his health was so poor that a farm worker named David Martin was brought in to help assemble the machine. So Fred would lie on a couch, and he would direct David Martin where to put the pieces because he was too weak to move them himself. E.K. Warren, writing in early 1875 that the mechanisms inside this machine were so difficult that Martin and I can take it all apart and put it together, but still cannot understand it. Over and over, E.K. Warren implored his brother Albert, who had some training as a watchmaker, to come back from California, where he was prospecting for gold, and join the Warren Brothers partnership. Albert is the greatest machine that the world ever saw. Fred never dreamed of half that it's capable of doing. E.K. offered to make Albert a full partner, at one point reassuring him, "You could get around it pretty well in a week." E.K. saying, though, that he had no aptitude for this kind of thing. E.K. and Fred were able to get the third machine ready to go on the road early in 1875. In February, the Warren calculating engine was exhibited in Niles, Michigan, and Morris, Illinois, and maybe some other spots that I haven't found out about. The tickets were 25 cents apiece, 15 cents for children. So they did take it on the road as a curiosity.
That was pretty big money.
Yeah, no, it's the cost of a movie now, I suppose, right? $10. I don't know how many people bought tickets, frankly, but it was enough so that newspapers did actually attend. The Detroit Free Press and the Berrien Record, a lot of local papers, Midwest papers attended. And E.K. wrote to Joseph Medill, the editor of the Chicago Tribune, and he hoped for more coverage, and he even offered to pay for the reporter's trip out here so that he could see the machine. And the reporter did in fact come, and on top of the calculating engine, there's a little notebook up there. That's essentially all the newspaper clippings that were written in the day about this thing. And even some national magazines, I can't remember if it was Harper's or the Atlantic, probably Harper's, wrote a piece about how it worked beautifully, and it congratulated the school children of the future who would no longer be burdened with dumb mathematics because of machine. They got a little ahead of out over their skis, as they say. But, so the reporter, though, would have to come out to Three Oaks to see the calculating machine, because by March, Fred Warren was too sick to leave home. He was living in his brother's house, and work on the machine was taking place in E.K.'s dining room. As I said, he would lie on the couch and kind of direct things. Edward Warren sensed that the machine was harming Fred's health. The doctor seems to think that if he could have a change to get his mind off the machine, then he might have several years. But by the end of March, EK sent a telegram to Albert. Fred is worse, bleeding at the lungs, very weak, dangerous condition. And on April 9th, 1875, he wrote Albert that the brother was dead. An article in the Berrien Record called Fred's invention, though, the most ingenious calculating machine ever invented. The article went on to say, it is so intricate as to be, perhaps, beyond the comprehension and understanding of any person or persons living. And Albert Warren had apparently resisted all the efforts by EK to bring him back from California and try and figure out this machine and make it work. So EK did not, however, give up on finding somebody mechanically minded to try and make this thing workable. He wrote to the Studebakers, the great carriage makers in South Bend. And Clement Studebaker wrote back that while the machine had a great deal of merit and he hoped EK could find someone to help him make a fortune out of it, that he and his brothers were just too busy on their own work to help out, that they had to attend to their own business, as it says. Then EK got in touch with P.T. Barnum, who had begun his greatest show on Earth 4 years earlier. The folks, however, at Barnum's Hippodrome replied that while the machine was doubtless a great curiosity, it should be displayed in a permanent museum. So they shot him down. A Boston mechanical engineer named George Grant offered to display Warren's machine at the Great Centennial Exposition of the United States in Philadelphia in 1876. He had a display place there. He said, I'll put Fred's machine in with mine, but then they cut back his display case and he had to drop that plan. And EK hoped that Warren would at least write an article for Scientific American to kind of say this machine is really something and sort of cement his place in history. But that never happened. A book written by the Featherbone Foundation 50 years later would claim that the calculating engine was at least 30 years ahead of its time, and Jay can really speak more to whether that's so. But Fred Warren was never celebrated for his innovation. No more calculating machines were built, and 40 years after its creation, the machine wound up on display at the Chamberlain Warren Museum in Three Oaks. And that museum then folded in 1952, as I said, and the collection including the calculating engine went off to storage at Michigan State University, which is where Chuck and I found it, right next to the World War I machine gun, a couple of years ago when we went for a visit. And again, they were very good about lending it to us for a couple of years, but nothing's happened. And I also have to say that I invited Jay out of the blue to participate in this about a year ago. And I said, do you want to go up to Lansing and see the machine? And he said, sure. So he was really game for this. And after a day spent in Lansing, I think your enthusiasm even increased. So because some of this drama that we witnessed was in the papers, and then he saw the thing.
No, I really want to thank Nick for pulling me into this. This has been, really fascinating. I think, as he mentioned, I wrote this book, I guess now it's about 10 or 12 years ago, and it actually kind of has a historical thread in it. And I went back and looked at some original papers that, actually went back in the 1700s. And the thing that, struck me from all of that was just how human, all these inventors are. And the more you read their letters and their papers, they remind you of people you work with and neighbors. It's like people haven't changed all that much. And as you look at Fred Warren's writings and his sense of humor and his trials and tribulations, the human side of this really comes through. What I'd like to do is explain a little bit about where this machine fits in history. What came before it and what came after it, and a little bit about how it works. But I think before I even do that, let's walk over for a second and take a look at the machine. So first of all, if you look at the bottom, you'll see that there are these dials that have numbers on them. And those are, for inputs into the system, and there are these little sliders that let you essentially kind of turn a gear to set what number. And this is, just like on any other adding machine, you've got your, your ones, your tens, your hundreds, your thousands, and so on. So it's set up like a lot of things that we've seen. There's also this comb in front and this lever, right? And the piece on the bottom, which we might call a carriage, lets you slide that, with the lever, you can sort of slide that carriage over left or right. And that has something to do, that I think is one of the novel things about this machine, and has something to do with multiplication and division, which was something, as far as I can tell, hadn't really shown up, on machines of this kind earlier. And we'll see. I'll show you an example of how that actually works. And then somewhere back there, there's a mirror in the back, and you can't sort of see what would be reflected in the mirror, but there also would have been a light in there, and the answers, the numbers in the solution would have been projected out the back and shown up on that mirror. But yeah, I wanted you to sort of get a visual sense of what's going on before we start talking about how it might work. The one that's kind of acknowledged as being maybe one of the first was Blaise Pascal. Back in 1642, a machine called a Pascaline. And the way that this would have worked is, let's say that you wanted to add, 11 plus 12. You might turn this dial to a 1 and then turn that dial to a 1. And if you wanted to add 12 to it, you move that one by another click and another one by 2 clicks, and you'd see the answers show up on the top. And so this, first appeared in the scene a long time ago and underwent, and this was just addition and subtraction. You turn the knobs the other way. But these things, started appearing a long time ago. This kind of thing, just looking around the room, most of us probably know what this is. I think the high school class that we had in yesterday probably had no clue. But works on the same basic principle, that there's gears inside between the 1s, the 10s, and the 100s columns, and by clicking it's the gears. And probably the cleverest thing of all of these designs really is, like, once you get around to 9 cents and hit the next click, this one's going to advance without pressing the button. So there's some pretty clever mechanical engineering in there. And this, of course, was made out of plastic and durable plastic, but you can imagine the difficulty of making something like this out of metal, out of thin metal, out of soft metal, and expecting to use it repeatedly and have it keep working. And that was, I think, one of the real challenges that Fred ran into, was that he chose to make his machine out of brass, which is a soft metal. So you might get one good calculation in there, but then as the teeth of the gears start, bending a little bit, its reliability becomes a challenge.
We haven't tested this one.
No. As Nick said, Fred was motivated by a machine called the Babbage difference engine, which I'll show in a second. But what actually kind of motivated Babbage was another machine that was called the Jacquard Blue in 1804. And many people think of this as being, in a sense, the first programmable machine. And so what you see is it's a standard loom, and of course, if people wanted to do repeated patterns, maybe make the same piece of cloth multiple times, or sequence when you're switching to a different color thread, or so on, somebody would manually put it through. What Jacquard's invention was punch cards, which we've of course seen in computers from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Punch cards probably stopped being used around the early 80s, late 70s. But the notion here wasn't to automate calculations. It was as you turned a crank on the loom and turned a crank on the program, it would automate which levers get raised and lowered so that you could repeatedly get the same pattern in cloth. And so this was kind of the first programmable machine. And so what Babbage did, 20 years later or so, inspired by Jacquard's work, he's like, well, we can kind of glue these things together. We have the work that Pascal and all of his follow-ons did on machines that can add and subtract. And then we'll have this thing with punch cards off to the side that can automate the computations. So if you're doing a sequence of additions, multiplications, subtractions, divisions, you could have your algorithm there in the punch cards, and that would sequence the operations that happen on the adding machine. This thing had just an amazing number of parts. It was a brilliant concept, but never got it to work.
That looks huge. How big?
It's huge, yeah, I mean,
10 or 12 feet
yeah, a
wide?
person is probably about that tall. It's huge.
So 10 or 12 feet tall.
Take up this whole wall.
Fred's machine, so Nick mentioned how, he had gotten his machine to a point, he reached out to the Studebakers and reached out to others, and he reached out to this gentleman named Grant in Philadelphia. And absolutely, there's no doubt that the work that Fred Warren had done influenced Grant, and his name is cited sort of in the historical record, as having influenced machines that came after it. And this thing right here that, I was so intrigued after, seeing the machine, I started digging into the history and found sort of that the ideas that came from Fred, that went through Grant, that went elsewhere, showed up in these things. So I actually bought this on eBay. This is what's called a Thales patent calculator. It was made in Germany around 1920. I picked this up on eBay. But if you look at it, it's got the same pieces. A lot smaller, a lot more durable, but it's got these sliders that let you enter the numbers. It's got a movable carriage that lets you do multiplication, and we'll show an example of that. It has the outputs, which would have been reflected on the mirror, and then the kerosene lantern or whatever up here, and the crank to enter the stuff. So this is a very, very similar design that started appearing, around 1920, maybe a little before that. And as we all know, variants of this machine probably went up into the 70s and the 80s, in the cash registers that we've seen, that here you enter the number by moving slides. In the cash registers we'd seen, there would be a series of buttons, but they performed the same function. So let's just look at, an example of addition, and then we'll go at multiplication, and feel free to come by. But if we wanted to add two numbers, so let's say that I wanted to add, 12 plus 13, or let's say 12 plus 34, for example. I could have put in a 1 here, and the 1's showing up, and then slide that down 2. So I've got a 12, and I'll turn the crank around once, and 12 shows up here. So the gears have spun a little bit, just like, that grocery store thing. And then if I wanted to add 34 to that, I'd dial in 34, we can see 34 here, turn the crank again, and I get 46. So some gears went in, and if it carries over, there's just like that grocery store calculator, it's got some clever mechanisms inside that would propagate the carry, over to the next column over. How would we do that? So we would say 4 times 12, right, which would give us 48. And then, really what we're doing is not 3 times 12, it's 30 times 12. So you'd slide everything over, because you're really saying 30 times 12, which would be 360, and then you add those columns up. So you need the ability to shift one column over. So let's take a look at how we would do this here. So I'll reset this by turning the crank. So we'll do 12 times 34. So what I'm going to do is put 12 in here, and so I've got 12. Now I need to multiply it by 4. How am I going to multiply it by 4? Like this: 1, 2, 3, 4. So I've now got 48.
My force goes up down.
I've got 48 sitting right there. Now I need to shift over one column, which I will do like that. Think about the lever and the comb. I shifted by one column. Now I'm going to multiply 3 times 12. How am I going to do that? I've still got my 12 here. I'll go 1, 2, 3. And I have 408 sitting there in the answer, which is the correct thing. And you can divide by kind of turning the crank the other way and seeing when it gets down to 0. And there's you'll get the answer here that says how many times have I turned the crank. But with World War II, and the need to do cryptography, and the need to calculate ballistic trajectories. So George Boole was kind of a pivotal figure. We now talk about Boolean logic or Boolean algebra. He was not wasn't thinking about building machines at all using his system. He wasn't even thinking of math. He was really just thinking about logic, the sort of, if Mr. Jones, has the cow and Mr. Smith, has the horse, then who has the llama, kind of logic questions. So his work kind of carried forward and sort of sat there in the background for a while. But let's look at how we could do math using logic, as opposed to turning gears. So let's look at multiplying ones and zeros. So we don't have to go into what Boolean arithmetic is and binary numbers in depth, but let's just assume all we have is a system that just has ones and zeros. And we're not learning about anything else. And we want to be able to put together a times table and use logic to explain what's going on in that times table. Well, so we want the logic for A times B. So there's 4 possibilities: 0 times 0, 0 times 1, 1 times 0, 1 times 1. These first 3, if you multiply them out, you get a 0. The last one, if you multiply them out, you get a 1. So what if we wanted to use logic to express a rule for when A times B is going to be a 0 and when A times B is going to be a 1? So A times B is going to be a 1 only if what? A and B are both 1. So we need to have a machine that lets us evaluate an and situation. All right? So how would you do that? And we know computers are made out of switches, right? So how flow? So if I think of the up position of the switch as being a 1 and the down position of the switch as being a 0, I'm only going to get the light bulb to turn on if both switches are in the up position, right? And a lot of us have this situation in our kitchen. Wherever we have switches on 2 different walls, if they're both in the right situation, the light will turn on. If either one of them isn't, the light won't. So if you just kind of take this idea of an and replicate it 1 billion times, and put it together the right way, you've got yourself a microprocessor. And so the question is, how do I take this very simple, basic element, like Fred had the idea with the gear, how do you organize these into a machine that you can use George Boole's math of logic and sort of this electrical, mechanical situation of switches to build something big? So it's really interesting. It all comes back to small towns in Michigan. So Claude Shannon, who was from Petoskey, Michigan, went to the University of Michigan, and he went off at around age 19, 20 to MIT, where he wrote a master's thesis that basically took, at age 21, wrote a master's thesis, which has been called the most important master's thesis written, that took the math of George Boole and tied it to the logic of switches and sort of put together the blueprint, of how you build electronic computers out of switches using logic. And so much flowed out of that. I think it was, 1938, I think he wrote that master's thesis, something like that. And we know what flowed from there. So it's interesting how things just kind of come back to small towns in Michigan.